Sat next to me is Dave Dickman from Tagger Media. Now, Dave, it's great to have you here at the show. Great to have you as a headline sponsor. Hopefully you're enjoying this very, very busy day. You've just finished your session, which is all about data privacy in the age of influencer marketing. So data, I think, has been a real key theme of the show this year, and definitely a theme, sort of a key word in the industry as a whole as well recently. And I think, successful campaigns are often dictated by accurate data. So how do brands use this data to inform strategies and deliver excellent campaign results?
Yeah, so thank you. We're thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. One of the things that might be helpful, because I just came off of this panel, maybe summarize a couple of the key points from everybody. Yeah, of course. So data is it's the true north in all of this. So there was a recent article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about the State of the Union not being good, meaning there's all this fraudulent activity and fake followers and there's no attribution, and oh my God. I think anybody who's in this space think that's an old narrative, because there are tools available to know if someone's got fake followers. There's tools available for attribution through a link. So, all of that, I think some of that just needs to go by the wayside in terms of how data is leveraged in the space. And it's a little bit of buyer beware. I think if you're at an agency or brand, it's really critical that you know what tools you're using and what questions to ask, because there's still quite a few tools that are scraping data and they're not supposed to scrape data, and they provide it to a brand, and is the onus on the brand, But if you ask the right questions, there's a lot of really robust information that's available.
Great. So you just talked about asking questions. What questions should brands be asking essentially then?
I think, first of all, brands look at influencers, they look at the influencer themselves, they look at the audience of the influencer and whether they're a viable candidate. So the questions they need to look at is there integrity in the data? Is this somebody I would want to hire? The look and feel, check that box. The second one is are the followers legit? Is this an interesting audience for me to market to? And are they going to be an easy person to work with? We live in a world now where if a particular influencer is difficult or the traffic looks a little dodgy, there's hundreds of other influencers that have a similar audience. I mean, no disrespect, because I know this is a really talented industry, but there's a lot of folks who are in this, so I think you can quickly move on.
Great. And so how do brands ensure that they are collecting data in an ethical way?
So there's platforms like Tagger Media. We pull all of the publicly available data from Instagram and Facebook and everything you would need. So I think looking at that data and weeding out anything that looks fraudulent, you have a pretty robust pool, and it's a global pool too. It's not just UK centric or US centric. There's folks all over the place. You have to be able to post out the campaign like a paid media execution, because ultimately you're looking for that ROI and measuring how effective was my influencer work against my cable investment or my digital investment other places. So it's really important to nail the creative and the execution, but ultimately, did you get what you hired the person to do?
Right. So what's the cost when that potentially goes wrong then, and how can brands avoid making those common mistakes?
I think, the tools they're very sophisticated and they're very easy to use. So it's, there's a lot of research that goes into, for instance, if I'm a brand, I can go on to a platform like a Tagger and say, who's talking about my brand organically? And one of my strategies might be I'd go to them to hire them because they're already talking about my brand. Or I could look at my competition and say, who have they hired? What's their strategy been? Who's talking about my competition? So you do that, you do a lot of research before you even start to go into hiring an influencer. So I think that's a critical piece of it. It depends on your strategies. If you're looking for awareness, if you're looking for actually you're selling a product or service, or what that looks like.
So although data is obviously clearly very important, and it's what we're talking about right now, do we need data and then that human element still? Is that still really, really important?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is a tough business. It's that always-on strategy if you're an influencer. I mean, massive respect. I think when they make it look really easy, it means it's not, like anything in life. So that creative part is really critical. And I'm always amazed at how many, if you look at the last 90 days, there's so many influencers that have fun with this. They're great. They're great to work with. They legitimately are happy to share their information with the brand because they want to be hired, right? And they know their audience is going to love what you're talking about.
Brilliant. So with so much data available right now, do you think in a few years' time we're going to look back and sort of think, wow, how little control we had over our data? Do you think that's going to change pretty soon?
I do. I think it'll change. I think ultimately the data rests with the influencer. And if I'm an influencer that wants to be hired for the right brand or agency, I'm happy to be transparent and give that information, essentially just to keep it flowing so there's no question about who I'm reaching or what that looks like. And I think we'll just get really lock solid in that regard. And there's a sharing of information that's good for both parties.
Great. So talking of the future,
Parties.
and parties. Do you think, what trends do you think we're going to see arise next year?
You know, there's in our industry a big dependence on Instagram, which has been fantastic. But in a world where the engagement's starting to dwindle a bit, and the likes component is interesting to some people if that goes away or not. I think other platforms, meaning TikTok, Snapchat, LinkedIn, I think depending on the business you're in, those are really meaningful platforms. So I think there's going to be less of a dependency on Instagram because there's some fatigue around that. And I think it's going to go to some of these other platforms. Whether they ultimately open up the APIs or not, I think there's just really robust audiences there. And then whatever else comes along, right? There's going to be a broadening out of different platforms, which is good for the industry where it's not so dependent on one particular platform.
Although with those other platforms such as TikTok, there's not quite the data that Instagram has yet. So do you think brands are slightly scared to use it, or do you think it's worth going for, because there's just not the data available yet?
Yeah. I think it is. We talked about this on the panel, oddly enough, with platforms like TikTok specifically, oftentimes without having the data. If you're a brand that can take some risks, and you should be there anyway, there's some benefit of being a first mover where you jump in early and say, look, I might not be able to measure it, but I know I need to be there and I'm gonna jump in, right? And so there's a little bit of risk with that, but maybe not so much. And so I think it depends on the product or service, but I always think there's a massive benefit to jumping in as an early adopter on some of these platforms, just because you build your visibility. And if nobody else is in that ecosystem, and as a brand I jump into that, it's great. No, it's really good. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us here today, and hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
All right, take care.